August 12, 1944. A dirt road outside Crawford, Nebraska. The canvas-sided army truck rattled over ruts baked hard by summer heat, and inside 30 German prisoners sat in silence, watching America pass through the gaps in the fabric. They had expected desert. They had expected barbed wire and cruelty. What they had not expected were the mailboxes. Muller, Schmidt, Hoffman, Bauer. Names painted in black letters on white wood, standing at the end of gravel driveways that led to red barns and windmills turning lazily under an endless sky. Names that could have been lifted from any village registry in Bavaria or Saxony. Names that belonged to their uncles, their neighbors, their own fathers. If you're finding this story as unsettling as those prisoners did, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether your own family name traces back across the ocean to a place that once felt like the only home in the world. The truck slowed at a crossroads, and through the dust, one of the men saw a grain silo rising against the horizon. Painted across its whitewashed surface in bold letters, Schneider Grain Co-op. The prisoner with that very name, Schneider, stared at it until the truck turned and the silo disappeared. His hands, calloused from months of combat in Tunisia, trembled slightly in his lap, and in that moment, sitting in the back of an enemy truck under armed guard, he realized something more disorienting than defeat. The war had not divided the world as cleanly as he had been told. It had split families. The journey to Nebraska had begun 6 months earlier, in the brutal heat of North Africa. The men aboard that truck had fought under Rommel, the Desert Fox, in campaigns that stretched from Libya to Tunisia. They had been told they were part of a superior force destined to reshape the world. But by the spring of 1943, the Africa Corps was collapsing. Supply lines had been strangled. Allied armor rolled in from every direction. Entire divisions surrendered in the sand. For men like Hans Kruger, a baker's son from Stuttgart, capture came with a strange relief. He had not eaten a full meal in 2 weeks. His boots were held together with wire. When British soldiers waved him forward with his hands up, he felt shame, but also the faint, guilty flicker of survival. They were loaded onto transport ships, packed into holds that reeked of salt water and diesel. The voyage across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. Rumors swirled in the dark. They were being taken to England, to Canada, to labor camps in frozen wastelands. No one mentioned Nebraska. When they arrived at Fort Robinson in the summer of 1944, the camp was nothing like they had imagined. There were barracks, yes, and barbed wire, but also baseball fields visible beyond the fence, and guards who did not beat them. The Geneva Convention was in effect. They were given clean clothes, issued blankets, fed meals of bread, beans, and occasionally meat. It was more food than many had seen in months. Still, the strangeness of it gnawed at them. America was supposed to be the enemy, but the enemy did not look starved. The enemy did not look bombed. The fields beyond the camp stretched green and gold under the sun, unbroken by craters or ash. By the time they were loaded onto trucks for farm labor details, the men had begun to understand the scale of what they were facing. This was not a country struggling to survive. This was a country so abundant it could afford to feed its prisoners while its own sons fought overseas. It was the kind of abundance that made defeat feel inevitable even if no one dared say it aloud. The farms themselves told the story more clearly than any propaganda ever could. In 1944, the United States produced more wheat than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. American tractors, massive, diesel-powered machines, worked fields that German horses could only dream of plowing. Nebraska alone grew enough grain to feed millions and still had surplus to export. The contrast was not subtle. It was crushing. Hans Kruger, riding in that truck on that August day, tried to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught. He had been told that America was weak, that its people were soft, that its industry was a hollow boast. But the barns he passed were freshly painted. The silos were full. The cattle were fat. And those names were the final, unshakable proof that something in the story had gone terribly wrong. The truck pulled into a farmyard just before noon, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. The prisoners climbed down stiffly, blinking in the bright sunlight. A civilian contractor with a clipboard stood waiting, flanked by two young American soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The contractor called out names, checking them against his list, and assigned groups to different tasks: sugar beet thinning, hay stacking, fence repair. Hans and 5 others were sent to a field where the beets grew in long, straight rows that seemed to stretch to the edge of the earth. They were handed hoes sturdy, American-made tools that felt solid in their hands, and told through gestures and broken English what to do. No speeches, no threats, just work. The sun climbed higher, and the men bent to their task. The rhythm of it was familiar. Many of them had grown up on farms, working their father's land before the war came and pulled them away. The smell of turned earth, the ache in the shoulders, the taste of dust had all carried them back to a time before uniforms and orders. But the familiarity only made the strangeness sharper. Across the field, painted on the side of a barn, was the name Bauer. One of the prisoners in the group was named Bauer. He saw it and stopped mid-swing, the hoe frozen in his hands. Another man nudged him, whispering, "Keep working, don't stare." But Bauer couldn't help it. That was his name, his family's name, a name that had been spoken in German kitchens and German churches for generations. And now it was here, painted in foot-high letters on a barn in Nebraska. At noon, the contractor's wife brought out lunch: cardboard boxes filled with sandwiches, thick slices of bread, real meat, slices of cheese along with apples and bottles of cold milk. The prisoners sat in the shade of a wagon and ate in silence, each bite a small revelation. In Germany, by 1944, bread was rationed. Meat was a memory. To sit in an enemy's field and eat like this felt surreal, almost obscene. One of the guards, a young man barely out of his teens, leaned against the wagon and watched them. He didn't speak German, and they didn't speak much English, but the silence between them was not hostile. It was simply the silence of men too tired and too confused to know what to say. After lunch, they returned to the rows. The sun beat down, relentless, and the work became a meditation. Hoe, step, hoe, step. The monotony left room for thought, and thought was dangerous. Heinz found himself remembering his grandfather's farm in Württemberg, the rows of beets his family had once tended. The land here looked almost identical. The soil was darker, richer even, but the work was the same. The rhythm was the same. And the names, those impossible, undeniable names, kept appearing. On mailboxes, on silos, on the sides of trucks that rumbled past on distant roads. Schneider, Müller, Hoffmann, Vogel. Each one a small shock, a reminder that Germans had been here long before the war, long before the Reich, long before any of this had seemed possible. By the time the truck came to collect them at dusk, the men were exhausted. They climbed back into the canvas-covered bed without a word, their bodies heavy with fatigue, their minds heavy with something else. The truck rattled back toward Fort Robinson, and through the gaps in the canvas, they watched the Nebraska landscape slide past endless fields, distant farmhouses, windmills silhouetted against the setting sun. One of them, a man named Dieter, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "What if they are our people? What if those farmers, Schneider, Bauer, Müller, what if they came from our villages?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and inescapable. That night, back in the barracks, the men lay on their bunks and stared at the ceiling. Some wrote letters home, carefully worded to pass the censors. Others played cards or read dog-eared books in German that had been donated by a local church. But the conversations always circled back to the same thing: the names. "They left," one man said bitterly. "They abandoned Germany and came here for an easy life, while we stayed and fought." Or, Dieter countered, "They left before the madness, before the Reich, before any of this. Maybe they saw what was coming and got out while they could. The argument simmered but never boiled over. They were too tired for that. And deep down, none of them were sure anymore what they believed. Hans thought about his own family. His grandfather had spoken once, years ago, about a cousin who had immigrated to America before the First War. The family had lost touch. Hans had never thought about it much until now. What if that cousin had settled in Nebraska? What if, somewhere in these fields, a distant relative was living a life that mirrored his own, but without the bombings, without the hunger, without the defeat? The thought was dizzying. It upended everything he had been taught about loyalty, about nationality, about what it meant to be German. If being German was a matter of blood and soil, then what did it mean that German blood had thrived in American soil? Over the following weeks, the routine continued. Every morning, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to farms across the region. They worked hard, the labor was real, the need urgent, and every day they were paid in small encounters that chipped away at the walls between enemy and neighbor. One afternoon, a little girl wandered to the edge of the field where Hans was working. She couldn't have been more than 6, barefoot and curious, clutching a rag doll. She stood and watched the prisoners for a long moment, then waved. Hans, caught off guard, hesitated, then lifted his hand and waved back. The guard saw it, but said nothing. The girl giggled and ran back toward the farmhouse, and Hans felt something crack inside him, something he couldn't name. Another day, a farmer named Heinrich Schultz, a man in his 50s with hands like leather, approached the group during a water break. He spoke slowly, in halting German, asking where they were from. When one of the prisoners said Bavaria, Schultz's face lit up. "Mein Vater," he said, tapping his chest. "From Würzburg." He smiled, a sad, complicated smile, and walked away. The prisoners stood in silence, unsure whether they had just spoken to a traitor or a brother. Not everyone was welcoming. Some families refused to come near the prisoners, their faces hard with grief and suspicion. One farmer spat in the dirt as the truck passed, his son overseas fighting men like these. The prisoners saw it and said nothing. They understood. But it was the accumulation of moments, the waves, the shared hymns sung softly in the chapel on Sunday mornings, the quiet nods from old men who remembered a Germany before the wars that made the mirror impossible to ignore. These were not strangers. These were echoes. Echoes of a world that, despite oceans and politics and uniforms, somehow felt like home. The first weeks in Nebraska had been strange and heavy. The land seemed endless, flat as far as the eye could see, stitched together by fences and windmills. The sky was enormous, so vast it made a man feel both free and small. When the prisoners arrived, they expected hatred. Instead, they were met mostly with silence, curiosity, and, at times, a kind of guarded decency. By the fall of 1944, that silence had softened into something else, a rhythm. The prisoners had settled into it, almost without realizing. The work was hard but steady, and for men who had come from battlefields and bombed cities, that steadiness was a gift. They repaired fences, harvested corn, tended livestock. Their hands grew rough again, not from war, but from labor, and that difference mattered. The food was better than anything they had known in months. Real bread, hot coffee, meat that wasn't gray or rationed. The guards treated them fairly, even kindly. One of them, Sergeant Collins, sometimes left a newspaper behind by accident. Others looked the other way when a prisoner paused to rest too long in the shade. It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but it wasn't hatred either. And slowly, grudgingly, some of them began to realize that captivity in Nebraska was not the hell they had feared. It was something far more disorienting. It was normal. They rose with the sun, worked the fields, ate together, sang in the evenings. Life took on a rhythm that felt almost human again. The days no longer felt like punishment. They felt like life continuing despite everything. The war, meanwhile, ground on far away. News filtered into the camp through guards, through the radio in the mess hall, through Red Cross letters written on thin paper that smelled faintly of home. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris had been liberated. Germany was retreating on every front. In the barracks, the men argued about what it all meant. Some clung to rumors of secret weapons, the rockets, the jets, the miracle that would change everything. Others fell silent, haunted by what they already knew in their hearts. They had seen the long retreat. They had seen the hunger in the eyes of captured soldiers. They had seen the collapse coming like a tide. Even laughter sounded different now, thin, forced, an echo of how things used to be. At night, the barracks fell quiet. Men stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside, pretending they weren't thinking about home. And through it all, the names on the barns and mailboxes remained. Constant, undeniable. Names like Schultz, Becker, Wagner, names they knew from their own villages. A reminder that identity was not as simple as a flag or a uniform. It was blood and soil and memory. Hans thought often about the farmer, Schultz, and his father from Würzburg. He thought about the little girl who had waved from the porch as they passed in the truck. He thought about the fields he had worked, the bread he had eaten, the strange kindness of a country that should have hated him. He thought, too, about home about Stuttgart, his mother's kitchen, his father's hands stained from factory grease, about the streets where he had walked as a boy, the sound of church bells over rooftops. He wondered if those bells still rang. He wondered if, when the war ended, there would be anything left to return to. Sometimes, late at night, he dreamed of home as it had been green and unbroken, and woke to the quiet hum of the Nebraska wind through the barracks slats. That was the cruelest part. The world he missed most might already be gone. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The news reached Fort Robinson by radio. The men gathered in silence to hear it, huddled close as if the truth could be made smaller by standing together. Some wept openly. Some sat stone-faced, unable to react. Others simply turned and walked away, their boots crunching in the dust, unable to process what it meant. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was finished. The flags, the salutes, the endless promises of glory, all of it gone in an instant. They were no longer soldiers. They were simply men, far from home, waiting to see what would happen next. For many, repatriation came slowly. Ships were needed elsewhere, supplies, troops, rebuilding. The logistics of returning millions of prisoners took time. So they stayed, working through one more harvest, watching summer fade into fall. By then, the land had begun to feel familiar. The smell of earth, the rhythm of the days, it no longer felt foreign. It felt lived in. When Hans boarded a ship for Europe in spring 1946, he stood on deck as the American coast faded beneath a gray sky. The sea wind was cold on his face. He thought of Nebraska, the barns with German names, the little girl who waved, the farmer who shared his bread, the mornings when the sun rose over the plains like forgiveness. He thought of Schultz and his father from Würzburg, of words half-spoken and kindness never fully understood, and he realized the war had taught him something the Reich never intended. Nations were only lines on a map, but people were everywhere. Sometimes the enemy looked exactly like family. Years later, some prisoners returned to America not as captives, but as immigrants, welcomed by the same farmers whose fields they once worked. They raised children who spoke English, played baseball, and never knew their fathers had worn an enemy's uniform. On quiet nights, those men told of barns with familiar names and of kindness that changed them. The lesson was simple. Enemies are made, not born. And sometimes all it takes to unmake them is a name, a wave, or soil that feels the same.